hospital discharge papers were still in my bag when he carried them into the house. Not our house, my parents' house, and set them on the kitchen counter like he was dropping off a package. He didn't look at me. My mother was standing in the doorway to the living room with her arms crossed, watching him the way she watches whether she doesn't trust. My father had gone to the garage, which is what he does when he doesn't know what to do with his hands. My husband, I'll call him my husband because that's what he was, legally, technically on paper. He set the bag down and he said, "Your mom can help you with the follow-up appointments." I put the insurance cards in the front pocket. I said, "Okay." He said, "I'll call you." I said, "Okay." And that was it. He walked back to his car, backed out of my parents' driveway in Raleigh, and I watched the taillights disappear past the oak tree at the end of the street. The oak tree my dad planted the year I was born. I used to think it was the most permanent thing I'd ever seen. 3 weeks earlier, a doctor at UNC Medical Center had told me I had stage 2 Hodgkin's lymphoma. Treatable, highly survivable. Those were the words she used, highly survivable. Like I was supposed to feel grateful for the odds. I was 31 years old. I'd just started a job as a physical therapist at a sports rehab clinic in Durham, and my husband of 4 years had spent most of the drive home from the oncologist sitting very still and not saying anything until we hit the I-40 merge, and then he'd said, "We need to talk about what this means for us." I should have known then. I didn't, or maybe I did, and I just didn't let myself. The treatment plan was 6 months of ABVD chemotherapy, then scans, then we'd see. He came to the first infusion with me. He sat in the chair next to my recliner and scrolled his phone for 2 hours while the drugs dripped into the port they'd placed below my collarbone. On the drive home, he said the smell of the clinic bothered him. Like antiseptic and anxiety, he said, like something trying too hard to be clean. I said, "I know. I have to sit in it." He didn't come to the second infusion. He didn't come to the third either, but he had a work trip which was real. The fourth, there was something with his truck. The fifth, I stopped asking. My best friend. I've known her since 7th grade. She still lives 2 streets over from where we grew up. She came to every single one. She'd bring a tote bag with snacks I couldn't always eat, and a new puzzle book and her laptop so we could watch something stupid together. She never once made a face about the smell. My husband and I didn't fight about it. That's the part people find strange. There was no screaming, no throwing things, no dramatic confrontation. There was just a slow, steady withdrawal, like water draining out of a bathtub after you pull the plug. You can't always pinpoint the moment it started. You just notice one day that the tub is empty. He moved his things out while I was at my parents' house for Thanksgiving. He left a note on the counter of our apartment. Not the kitchen counter, the bathroom counter, next to my toothbrush. I'm not sure if that was intentional or not. It said, "I'm not able to do this. I'm sorry. The lease is paid through January. I'll have my lawyer reach out." His lawyer reached out in early December. Mine reached out back. By February, we had a settlement agreement. By April, we had a signed divorce decree. Hodgkin's lymphoma has a funny way of clarifying paperwork timelines. My last chemo infusion was in March. The scans in April came back clean. Remission. I sat in my car in the hospital parking garage and cried for 20 minutes. And then I called my parents, and then I called my best friend, and then I sat there for another 10 minutes just breathing. I thought about calling him. I had his number still. I hadn't deleted it. I don't know why. Maybe because deleting it felt like a decision I wasn't ready to make permanent. I didn't call. I drove back to my parents' house. I was still living there because the apartment had been too much financially and otherwise, and my mom had made chicken and dumplings because it was the one thing that had never made me nauseous during treatment. We ate at the kitchen table and my dad kept patting my hand and not saying much, and that was enough. That was more than enough. I want to tell you that I had a plan. I want to tell you that from the moment he left, I was cool and calculating and 3 steps ahead. That would make a better story. The truth is, I spent most of those first months just trying to stay upright. Shimo brain is real. You forget words, you lose sentences mid thought, you stand in the grocery store in front of the cereal aisle for 4 minutes because you cannot remember what you came for. I was not strategizing. I was surviving. But survival has its own kind of intelligence. You don't always know you're building something until you look back and see what you've built. I went back to work in May, part-time at first, then full-time by summer. My patients were mostly athletes, college kids with ACL tears, weekend warriors with rotator cuff damage, a few older adults rehabbing hip replacements. I liked the work. I liked having somewhere to be, something concrete to do with my hands, a reason to get out of the apartment I'd finally rented on my own in Cary, 11 minutes from my parents. It was small. One bedroom, second floor, a window in the kitchen that looked out at a parking lot, and, if you lean slightly to the left, a strip of sky. I put a plant on the windowsill, then two plants. By fall, I had 7 plants and a coffee maker that I'd splurged on because I'd decided that some things were worth spending money on, and coffee was one of them. My best friend's father-in-law threw a dinner party in September. She'd married into a family that throws dinner parties, which I'd always found slightly hilarious because she grew up eating off paper plates like the rest of us. But her father-in-law, I'd met him a few times at their wedding, at holidays. He was hosting a fundraiser for a pediatric cancer foundation he ran, and she'd asked me to come because she thought I might like the people. And also, she said, because I'd been cooped up too long. She wasn't wrong. I went. I wore the green dress I'd bought specifically because I'd lost my hair during treatment, and I told myself that when it grew back, I would buy something that looked good on me and wear it somewhere that wasn't a clinic. My hair was back by then, shorter than it used to be, softer, a little different in texture, like it had come back from somewhere and brought something new with it. He was seated at the end of the table, across from his daughter-in-law, which put him diagonally across from me. 70s, white-haired, the kind of posture that comes not from vanity, but from a lifetime of believing your presence matters. He ran a medical device company he built from nothing in the 80s and sold majority shares of in 2019, and he'd spent the years since running the foundation. I knew a little of this because my best friend had mentioned it, and I'd looked him up after she invited me, which I do with most people I'm going to meet at things. I like to know the shape of a room before I walk into it. We didn't talk much at dinner. He asked me what I did. I told him. He asked a few follow-up questions that were more specific than I expected, about particular rehab protocols, about outcomes research, and I gave real answers instead of social ones. At the end of the night, he handed me his card and said his foundation worked with a physical therapist consultant, but they'd been thinking about expanding the program, and if I was interested, I should reach out. I looked at the card on the drive home. I looked at it again on my kitchen counter that night. I want to be honest with you about what I was thinking, because I think people assume a certain kind of story when they hear the details. Here's what was actually in my head. I had just gone through something that had nearly killed me, and the person who had promised to be there had left, and I was 31 years old and starting over, and this man was offering me a professional door that I had the skills to walk through. That's it. That's what I was thinking. Not a scheme, not a long game, just a door, and the awareness that I was the kind of person who could open it. I emailed him 2 days later. We met for coffee. It turned into a consulting arrangement by October. The foundation work was different from anything I'd done before. It was smaller in some ways. I wasn't seeing patients daily. I was advising on program design, on how to structure physical therapy access for kids going through cancer treatment. But it was bigger in other ways that I hadn't expected. You think about the body differently when the body has been through something. You think about recovery differently. I had a perspective that a lot of people don't have, and he saw that, and he let me use it. We started talking more. Not romantically. I want to be very clear because I know how this sounds and I know what people will assume. He was widowed. His wife had passed 4 years earlier from pancreatic cancer, and he missed her in the particular way that people who've had good marriages miss people. Not dramatically, but constantly, like a frequency that's always there. He had a son. He had a grandson from a previous relationship of the son's, a boy he rarely saw. He told me about the son one evening after a foundation board meeting when we'd stayed late going over budget proposals and everyone else had left. He said it matter-of-factly, the way people talk about wounds that have been open long enough to stop hurting acutely. His son was 40, lived in Atlanta, worked in finance, had never quite managed to become the person his father had hoped. There'd been a girl, years ago. A baby. The son had walked away from both of them, and the rift with his father had never fully healed. I said, "I'm sorry." He said, "I have a grandson I've met twice. He's 6. His name is Owen. He lives in Charlotte with his mother, who I understand is a very capable person." He looked out the window when he said it, the way my dad goes to the garage. I said, "Have you tried to reach out to her?" He said, "I don't think she'd want to hear from me. My son left her." I said, "You're not your son." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "No, I suppose I'm not." I did not come home that night and start planning anything. I want to be clear about that too. What I actually did was drive home, make tea, and sit on my couch and think about the fact that somewhere in Charlotte there was a 6-year-old boy who had a grandfather who thought about him and didn't know how to reach across the distance his son had created. I thought about that because I have a father who went to his garage when he didn't know what to say but who came back inside every single time, who drove me to infusions when I'd finally asked, who sat with me in waiting rooms and pretended he wasn't scared. Not everyone gets that. Not everyone even knows what it looks like. The next time I saw him, I mentioned it again. Not the boy, his son. I asked, carefully, what the relationship was like now. He said his son had been reaching out more lately. He didn't trust the timing. His son had made some investments that hadn't worked out, and suddenly there was interest in repairing things, which felt less like reconciliation and more like reconnaissance. I said, "Does he know about the foundation?" He said, "Everyone knows about the foundation." I said, "Does he know what it's actually worth? To you, I mean, not financially." He looked at me for a long moment. He said, "That's an interesting question." He said, "Most people don't ask it that way." I told my best friend about all of it in pieces, over the course of months. Over the phone and over wine on her back porch and once in the car line at her daughter's school, because that's where we end up having the most honest conversations. She's the only person I told everything to. She was not entirely without reservation. She said, "I just want to make sure you know what you're doing." I said, "I'm doing my job. I'm doing work I'm good at for a cause I care about." She said, "And the other part?" I said, "What other part?" She gave me the look she's been giving me since 8th grade, the one that means you know exactly what I'm talking about. I said, "I like him. He's a good person." I'm not doing anything wrong," she said. "I didn't say you were." I said, "You implied." She said, "I implied that you're 31 and you went through something enormous and you're attaching to the first person who made you feel capable and seen." I sat with that for a minute. I said, "Maybe, but maybe he's also just a good person who needs someone in his corner who isn't trying to get something from him." She didn't argue with that. She refilled my glass instead, which is her version of conceding a point. The son called him in February, his son from Atlanta, and said he wanted to come visit, to reconnect. He told me about it at work and I could see the way he was holding the information, like something fragile. He hadn't decided whether to step down or carry. I said, "What do you want to do?" He said, "I don't know. Part of me wants to believe it's real." I said, "What does the other part say?" He said that he's broke and he's coming for the house. He'd mentioned the house before, a property outside Asheville, land that had been in his wife's family that he'd maintained through the estate. It was the kind of asset that looks one way on paper and a different way to someone who grew up watching their father work. I said, "You don't have to decide anything right now. Let him come, watch what he does." He said, "That's cold." I said, "It's careful. There's a difference." He looked at me for a moment and then laughed, a real laugh, not polite. He said, "You know, when we first met, I thought you were very gentle." I said, "I am gentle. I just know how to be something else when I need to be." The son came in March. I wasn't there for the visit, but I heard about it after. He'd arrived with gifts, expensive bourbon, a photo album he put together of old family pictures, a story about how he'd been doing a lot of reflection and really wanted to repair things. He'd asked somewhere in the first evening whether his father had thought any more about estate planning, whether the Asheville property was tied up in the trust or still in the estate directly. He went back to Atlanta 4 days later. His father called me the evening after he left. He didn't say much. He said, "You were right." I said, "I'm sorry." He said, "Don't be. I knew. I just needed to know for certain." I said, "What are you going to do?" He said, "I think I want to call Owen's mother. If she'll speak to me." I said, "She will. I think she's been waiting for someone in your family to be worth talking to." He was quiet for a long time. He said, "Will you help me figure out what to say?" I should tell you about the moment I understood what was actually happening, not with him and not with the foundation, but with me. It was a Tuesday in April, a year almost to the day from when my divorce had been finalized, and I was sitting in a conference room with 3 board members and a foundation attorney going over a revised program budget, and I was the one at the head of the table. And I was the one who had prepared the numbers. And when someone asked a question about long-term sustainability, I answered it clearly and completely, and no one looked surprised, because by this point, they expected that from me. And I thought, I built this, not a scheme, not a plan I made from the floor of my parents' house, just one decision at a time, one door walked through, one real answer given instead of a social one. The woman I'd been when my husband left me with a note on the bathroom counter had been scared and sick and not at all sure she would be standing anywhere a year later. And here I was, standing at the head of a table, healthy. I thought about him, my ex-husband, and I felt almost nothing. Not satisfaction, not bitterness, something quieter. The way you feel about weather that happened a long time ago. It rained for a while. It doesn't rain anymore. He knocked on my office door one afternoon in May and said his son was calling again. He said this time the son had mentioned Owen, said he'd been in contact with Owen's mother, said he wanted to be more present in his son's life, said he'd heard his father had been in contact with her too, and he didn't think that was appropriate. He said the word appropriate, the way someone says it when they mean inconvenient to me specifically. I said, "What did you say?" He said, "I told him Owen's mother and I have a professional relationship and a personal friendship, and that I wasn't interested in his opinion about either." He paused. He said, "He's going to make trouble. He's already talked to the estate attorney." I said, "Do you have your own attorney?" He said, "I have 3. I said, "Then you're fine." He said, "He'll try to come after the foundation. He'll say I'm being influenced." I looked at him straight. I said, "Are you?" He looked back at me, and he did something I hadn't seen him do before. He smiled, a real one, the kind that starts in the eyes and comes from somewhere he doesn't show often. He said, "Not in any way that isn't my own choosing." The confrontation happened on a Thursday. The son flew in unannounced. He arrived at the foundation offices mid-morning, which is where his father happened to be, and I happened to be because we had a board call at 11. I was in the hallway with a cup of coffee when he came through the glass door, and I knew who he was immediately. Same jaw, same posture, same way of taking up space that his father had, but with none of the gravity that made it mean something. He looked at me and said, "Who are you?" I said, "I'm the program director. Can I help you?" He said, "I'm here to see my father." I said, "Let me let him know you're here." He said, "I don't need you to let him know anything. I'll go back myself." I said, "I'll let him know you're here." And I walked back to the conference room and I knocked and I opened the door and I said his father's name and I said, "Your son just came in." I told him I'd let you know. He stood up slowly. He smoothed his jacket. He said, "Thank you." He walked out to the lobby, and I stayed in the doorway, and I heard the son's voice go up immediately. "This is not appropriate. This is not what Mom would have wanted. You're being manipulated by someone half your age. This is about the estate, and you know it." And I watched him stand there and wait for it to be finished, the way you wait for weather. When the son stopped talking, he said, "Are you done?" The son said, "Dad," he said, "Owen is 6 years old. He has my wife's eyes. I've seen him exactly twice, and both times he called me sir because nobody had told him he could call me anything else. That ends now, whether you're comfortable with it or not." The son started again. He said something about lawyers. He said, "Send them. I'll have mine waiting." He looked at me then, briefly, and I gave him the smallest nod, the kind that means you're good. "And I'm here, and you don't need to explain anything to anyone." He turned back to his son. He said, "I think you should go back to Atlanta." He did. I won't tell you things resolved cleanly, because they didn't. There were attorneys. There were letters. There was a period of about 6 weeks where the foundation board convened an external review, which found nothing, because there was nothing to find. I gave a statement. He gave a statement. The estate attorney confirmed that nothing had changed in the primary documents and that the son's concerns were, legally speaking, speculative. Owen and his mother drove up from Charlotte on a Saturday in June. He had his grandfather's eyes. I saw it immediately, though his mother would tell me later that nobody had ever said that to her before, that everyone usually said he looked like his father, which she didn't find particularly comforting. He was small and serious, and he shook my hand when we were introduced, like he'd been taught to, and then he spent the next 2 hours asking his grandfather detailed questions about the koi pond in the garden, and whether the fish had names, and whether he could name the ones that didn't. I sat on the garden bench with his mother while the two of them crouched over the pond. She's a kindergarten teacher. She'd moved to Charlotte after the son left, built a life there on her own terms, raised her boy in a 2-bedroom apartment with good light and a dog she'd adopted for company. She looked at them at the pond and she said, "I spent a long time being angry at that whole family." I said, "That makes sense." She said, "He's not like his son." I said, "No, he's really not." She said, "Are you two?" She gestured vaguely. I said, "He's like the father I got a second chance to know." She looked at me for a moment. She nodded. She said, "Good, he needed that." My ex-husband texted me in August. I don't know how he heard. Small city, shared circles, these things get around. He said he'd heard I was doing really well. He said he was glad I was healthy. He said if I ever wanted to grab coffee and catch up, he'd love that. I read the message. I put my phone down. I made dinner. Pasta, nothing special, the kind you make on a Tuesday when you're tired and cooking something easy feels like a small kindness to yourself. I ate at my kitchen table. My plants were doing well. The one on the windowsill had started trailing down toward the counter, which meant it needed a bigger pot, which I'd been meaning to do for weeks. I picked up my phone again. I deleted the message. Not because I was angry, not because I wanted him to suffer. just because there was nothing there anymore, not even enough to be worth a coffee. Some things you don't need to revisit. Some doors close and you don't go back and knock on them because everything that mattered is already on the side you're standing on. I repotted the plant that night. Bigger pot, fresh soil, good drainage. I put it back on the windowsill. It's been growing well since then. I've thought a lot about what actually changed my life, and the honest answer is not the cancer, and not the divorce, and not any single moment where I made some brave decision. What changed my life was a series of very small choices that I made while I was too exhausted to overthink them. That's the part nobody talks about. You don't rebuild yourself in a grand gesture. You do it in increments so small they're almost invisible. You answer an email. You show up to a dinner party in a green dress. You give a real answer instead of a social one. And then one day you look up and you're somewhere entirely different from where you started. What I know about my ex-husband is that he made his choices too, and those choices told me everything I needed to know. Not about his character in some sweeping moral sense, but about what he was actually capable of when something asked more of him than he had. That's not a judgment, that's just information. And I think a lot of us waste years being angry at people for not being what we needed, when the cleaner thing, the harder but cleaner thing, is to simply accept what they showed us and move accordingly. He showed me. I moved. What I know about my father-in-law, the man who handed me a business card at a dinner party and asked follow-up questions I wasn't expecting, is that he spent years believing the silence between him and his grandson was his son's fault, and therefore outside his control. And that belief cost him years with Owen. The moment he understood that he was not his son, that the distance was something he could close himself regardless of what his son did, everything shifted. Cause and effect. You act, things move. You wait for someone else to act, things stay still. I think about that often when I'm tempted to wait, when I'm tempted to let someone else's choices determine my options. There's something about going through something serious, genuinely serious, the kind of thing that makes you think about your own body in ways you never had before, that recalibrates what you're willing to tolerate, not in a dramatic way, just quietly. You stop spending energy on things that don't return anything. You stop explaining yourself to people who weren't there. You get very clear, very quickly, about what actually matters and what was just habit dressed up as necessity. I think the quality that carried me through was not courage. I'm not sure I was particularly brave. I think it was honesty, a willingness to see things as they were rather than as I wished they were. To see my marriage clearly, to see myself clearly, including the parts I didn't love. To see opportunity when it appeared and not talk myself out of it because it looked different from what I'd planned. Integrity, I think, is just honesty applied over time. You tell the truth once, that's a moment. You keep telling it to yourself, to the people who matter, in the choices nobody else sees. That becomes a life. That's what I was building, not a strategy, a life. The plant on my windowsill is doing well.